Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about the difference of two cubes, how to factor the difference of two cubes. So for example, a cubed minus b cubed. So when you have a binomial, and there's a subtraction between the two terms, and each base, these bases here, are being raised to the third power, then this is the difference of two cubes. Now it turns out you can factor the difference of two cubes this way. So you'll say, now it will be a binomial times a trinomial. A binomial times a trinomial. All right, and here's how you factor the difference of two cubes. So you're going to take the first base, which is a, minus, you're going to take the second base, which is b. So my binomial is a minus b. Your trinomial will be, okay, now I'm going to take my first base, which is a, and I'm going to square it. And I'm going to take the, and there will be a plus sign. So you're going to say, you're going to take the opposite of this sign right here. So it'll be plus. And you're going to take the first base, which is a, and you multiply by the second base, which is b. And then it's going to be plus, and then the second base squared. So that's the formula. That's the formula for finding or for factoring the difference of two cubes. So it's the once you get in this form, once it looks like this, you're going to say the first base minus the second base, so a minus b, times a squared plus, change the sign, plus the product of these two bases, ab, and then plus b squared. Okay, b squared. All right, so let's multiply this out and make sure we get this back. So just to show you that if I were to multiply this out, I would get this back. So I'm going to rewrite this over. All right. Now remember last semester how you multiplied a binomial times a trinomial. Now remember, you can't use a FOIL method here. You cannot use a FOIL method because in order to use a FOIL method, you have to have a binomial times a binomial. This is not a binomial. So what you did last semester was you took each term of the first polynomial, the first factor, and you multiplied it by the second polynomial, the second factor. So in other words, the next step would be a times this trinomial, this factor, minus b times this polynomial. Okay, so we took each term of the first polynomial multiplied by the second, and then to get rid of the parentheses, we're going to use the distributive property. So a times a squared is a cubed. A times ab is a squared b. A times a positive b is a positive ab. Oops, a positive ab. And over here, I'm going to distribute the negative b. So I'm going to get negative a squared b. Over here, a negative b times a positive ab is a negative ab squared. And over here, a negative b times a positive b squared is a negative b cubed. And so when I combine like terms, I'm going to get a cubed. All right, over here, I'm going to get a squared b, and then a positive a squared b, and a negative a squared b is 0. Their sum is 0. Over here, that should be a squared right here. So remember a, oops. Let's see, I did something wrong. Let me see where I messed up. A times, okay, that's AB, that's correct. And then minus B All right, let's figure this out. A times, make sure I wrote this correct each time. A squared plus AB plus B squared. A times is A cubed. This is A squared. Oops. Okay, right here. I forgot the B. This is B squared. All right, so A times B squared is AB squared. All right, so, and the reason I knew that I made a mistake was because I wanted these two things to add up to be 0. So I forgot the squared here from here. All right, and then so these right here add up to be 0, these two terms, and you're left with minus b cubed. Okay, so when I multiply this out, I do get this. So to factor the difference of two cubes, you're going to say a minus b times, and then to get this trinomial, to get that second factor, you're going to square the first binomial plus, change the signs, plus, and then you're going to multiply these two bases together, and then you're going to say plus, and you're going to square the second base. Okay? All right. So let's look at some examples where we factor the difference of two cubes. Okay, so let's look at this example. So we're going to factor. All right, number 1. Suppose we had 8a cubed minus 1. 8a cubed minus 1. Okay, well, just like the previous factoring exercises we've done, you always want to look for the GCF. The GCF here is 1. Then the next thing you notice is that you have a binomial right here. So you have a binomial. And previously we looked at the fact that our binomials were the difference of two squares. Now obviously this is not the difference of two squares because this is cubed. So then you want to check and see is this the difference of two cubes? Well, just like with the difference of two squares, you're going to do that same thing, except instead of squaring, you're going to say cube. So can I write 8a cubed as something raised to the third power? And the answer is 2a, because 2a times 2a times 2a is 8a cubed. Okay, so that goes here. So 8a cubed I can write as 2a, that base 2a raised to the third power. Now this base right here, what times itself 3 times is 1, and the answer is 1, because 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. So this right here, this is the difference of two cubes. So I can factor the difference of two cubes using this formula right here. All right, so watch what we do. All right, so remember so I'm going to write this as f minus L. Instead of a minus b, I'm going to say f minus L times, I'm going to square the first. And remember, you take the opposite sign, so it'll be plus FL plus L squared. All right, so I just wanted to write it here. Okay, so I take the first, which is 2a, and if you need to write it out, write it out. So we're going to have 2a, that's my first, minus the last, my last is 1, so I get this binomial. Remember, when you factor the difference of two cubes, you're going to get a binomial times a trinomial. The binomial is easy, it's just 2a minus 1. That's your binomial. Now for the trinomial, don't make it difficult, make it easy on yourself. This says I got to take that first term and I got to multiply it by itself 2 times. So think of it that way. So I'm taking 2a and I've got to multiply by itself 2 times. Well, 2a times 2a, that's this right here, 2a times 2a is 4a squared. So that goes here, 4a squared. Okay, so that's the first term of my trinomial. Then I got to say plus, not minus. Remember, we take the opposite sign, plus, and then I got to find the product of my first and the last terms. In other words, I got to take 2a and I got to multiply it by 1. Well, 2a, remember that's your f and that's your L. Your first, what's inside your first parentheses, what's inside your second, your last parentheses. So 2a times 1 is 2a. So that goes here. And then this says I take the that second parentheses, that base, and I square it. Well, 1 times 1 is 1. So that goes here, plus 1. And so that's your answer. You're done. So you factored the difference of two squares as 2a minus 1 times, and notice you write it out. Don't do it in your head. You're going to mess up. So remember, this right here means I take that first parentheses, that base, inside the first parentheses, and I multiply by itself twice. That's what that says. So 2a times 2a is 4a squared. So that goes here. Then the second term of that trinomial says I multiplied the first and the last, so 2a and 1, and I get 2a, so that's plus 2a. And then the last term of that trinomial says I square that last term that's inside that parentheses, 1, and I got 1 times 1 is 1. Okay, so that's this. All right, so let's look at another example. So it's not that difficult because you're just using this formula. So you just have that formula on the side, and you'll be able to factor all of these problems. Okay, so let's look at number 2. Suppose we had this example. Let's see. All right, suppose we had this one. Suppose we had all right, x cubed, y cubed, minus 64. X cubed, y cubed, minus 64. All right, now don't let the fact that here you have two variables throw you off. It's that same idea. All right, so first of all, the GCF is 1. Then what you want to do next is since you have two terms and you have exponent 3, check and see if this is the difference of two cubes. So is this right here the difference of two cubes? So in other words, well, first of all, the 64 is easy. What times itself 3 times is 64? Well, the answer is 4. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 4 is 64. Over here, what times itself 3 times is x cubed, y cubed? Well, think about it. It's going to have to be xy. Because xy times itself 3 times is x cubed, y cubed. X times x times x is x cubed. Y times y times y is y cubed. So this is the difference of two squares. All right, so now remember, think of it this way. This is your F and this is your L. So that's your F and that's your L in terms of this formula right here. Okay, so in terms of that formula, this is going to be the answer. In terms of the formula, this says it's going to be F minus L, that's your binomial. So xy minus 4. That's your binomial, xy minus 4. Times, all right, now your trinomial. To find your trinomial, you may need to do some work here. So this says I take the first term, which in this case is xy, and I square it. In other words, I multiply by itself twice. So actually write it out. xy times xy, just like this. F times f. That's your f squared. Okay? So f squared is f times f, so that's xy times xy, which is x squared, y squared. So that goes here, x squared, y squared. That's your first term of that trinomial. Then remember, the difference of two squares, so when you factor it, that second term is going to have a plus symbol right here. All right, so then it says I multiply the f times the L. All right, well, f times L, if f is xy, times L, and L is 4, I get 4xy. So xy times 4 is 4xy, so that goes here. And then finally, this says I square the last term, which is 4. 4. Now remember, L squared means L times L. So in this case, it's 4 times 4, which is 16. So that becomes plus 16, and there's your answer. You're done. Okay? So that's how you factor the difference of two cubes. Let's look at a couple more. Let's suppose I had, let's say, this one. 27 minus t cubed. 27 minus t cubed. All right, so the GCF, always look for GCF of this polynomial. The GCF is 1. All right, so then you want to check and see, all right, I have two terms, there's a subtraction, so let's see if that's the difference of two cubes since the exponent's 3. So in other words, can I fill in these parentheses? And I can, because 3 times itself 3 times is 27. Here, t times itself 3 times is t cubed. So this right here is the difference of two cubes. So think of this as your F and this is your L, and use your formula. Remember, the formula is F minus L times F squared plus FL plus L squared. So that's how you factor the difference of two cubes. So let's use this. So my answer is going to be very simple. It's F minus L, so 3 minus T times, all right, now this says, do the work here. This says I take F and I multiply by itself twice. I square it. So that's 3 times 3, which is 9. So that goes here. Okay? That's 9. Then remember, you're going to say plus, and then you got to find FL. Well, F is 3, L is T, so that's 3 times T. So that's 3T. That goes here. And then plus, and then this says I square L. So I take L and I multiply by itself twice. Well, L is T, so I'm going to say T times T, which is T squared. So that's plus T squared, and there's your answer. So 3 minus T is your binomial. Your trinomial is 9 plus 3T plus T squared. All right. Now, you're not going to have time on a test to check this, but you can check. You can check this if you want to, the way we did at the beginning of this lesson. So you're going to take each term of this binomial and multiply by the trinomial, and hopefully we'll get this back. Again, here you have time, but on a test you would not. But let's check. So you're going to say 3 times this, 9 plus 3t, plus, that's plus t squared, minus t times this trinomial, 9 plus 3t plus t squared. And so if I distribute, I get 27 plus 9t. 3 times 3t is 9t. 3 times t squared is 3t squared. Over here, distribute the negative t. Negative t times 9 is a negative 9t. Negative t times positive 3t is a negative 3t squared. A negative t times a positive t squared is a negative t cubed. Combine like terms, I get 27. A positive 9t and a negative 9t is 0. A positive 3t squared and a negative 3t squared is 0. And all you're left with is minus t cubed, which is what you wanted. Okay, so that was number 3. Let's look at this example, number 4. Okay, so let's suppose we had, let's say, try to find one real quick. All right, let's just do this one. Now this one's a little bit more complicated, but let's see if we can work on this one. So this will be x cubed y cubed minus z to the 6th. X cubed, y cubed, minus z to the 6th. Okay, so again, the GCF is 1. So check and see if this is the difference of 2 cubes, since these are 3's right here. So see if you can fill in these parentheses. All right, now this part's easy because xy times itself 3 times is x cubed, y cubed. Now be careful here. You may need to review a couple of things from last semester. So remember last semester, if I have x squared raised to the 5th power, let's say. Remember, when you multiply, or when you raise a power raised to a power, when you have a power raised to a power, you multiply exponents. So x squared raised to the 5th power is x to the 10th. All right, so remember that means this right here means I take the base, and I multiply by itself 5 times. So that means x squared times x squared times x squared times x squared times x squared. And so when you multiply like bases, you add exponents. So 2 added to itself 5 times means 5 times 2, so that's 10. So when you have a power raised to power, you multiply the powers, and you get 10. So that's x to the 10th. So over here, the same idea. So what cubed is going to be z to the 6th? Okay? So the answer is z squared. So think about it. Z squared, that's a 2. 2 times 3 is 6. All right, so when you have a power raised to power, so that's a power rule. When you have a power raised to power, you multiply. Power rule. You multiply and you get z to the 6th. So this right here is the difference of 2 cubes. All right, so this is my f, this is my l, and so I just use the formula. So remember, it's f minus l right here. F minus l times f squared plus fl, the product of f and l, and then plus the last squared. Okay, so I'm going to get xy, f minus l, so xy minus z squared. So that's going to be the answer right here. All right, so I'm going to get my binomial will be xy minus z squared. So there's my binomial. All right, let's look at the trinomial. So to get the trinomial of my factorization, this says I'm going to take f, I'm going to multiply by itself twice. So I'm going to square it. So f is xy. So this right here is be xy times xy, which is x squared y squared. So that's going to go here. So that'll be my first term of my trinomial. Plus, so plus, this says I take the first and I take the last and I multiply them together. So xy times z squared is xyz squared. Nothing else you can do there. xyz squared. That's what that is. Then this says I take the last and I multiply by itself twice. So I take the last and I square it. So the last is z squared. Now be careful with that one. That means z squared times itself, because I'm squaring it. So I'm multiplying by itself 2 times. Well, when you multiply like bases, remember you add exponents. So that's z to the 4th. So that goes here, plus z to the 4th. And there's your answer. All right. Let's do one more with this. So let's suppose you had this one. So let's suppose you had 250 r cubed minus 128 t cubed. So 250 r cubed minus 128 t cubed. Now, here's the situation. Remember, you must always look for GCF first. Now, if you forget to do that and you say, all right, this is the difference of 2 cubes, and you come right here and you check, you're going to notice that no number times itself 3 times is 250. And no number times itself 3 times is 128. So you can have an issue there. So you can't go directly to checking to see if that's the difference of 2 squares, because you got to find your GCF. And the GCF is something other than 1. The GCF here is, what is it, 2? Let's see if it's 2. So I'm going to factor out the 2. And when I factor out the 2, I'm going to get, let's see, that's going to be 125 r cubed minus, and that's going to be what, 64 t cubed. And so there's nothing else, oops, right here. So 2 times 125 is 250, and then 2 times 64 is a negative 128. And there's nothing else I can factor out, so the GCF was 2. All right. But look at this, just like we talked about before, you can't say that's the answer because you need to check and see if this factor, this binomial, can be factored further. So in other words, can I factor 125 r cubed minus 64 t cubed? So can I factor this? So is this the difference of 2 cubes? And this actually is, because 5r times itself 3 times is 125r cubed. Because remember, 5 times 5 is 25, and 25 times 5 is 125. Over here, that's going to be 4t, because 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. T times t times t is t cubed. So this is the difference of 2 cubes. So here's your F, and here's your L. There's your F, and there's your L. And so remember, we're gonna say F minus L. So there's your binomial, 5r minus 4t times, all right, your trinomial. Remember this is F squared plus FL plus L squared. So that's what goes here. So if 5r is denoted as F, my first term inside that parentheses, then this says I'm going to multiply by itself twice. So that right here means 5r times 5r, which is 25r squared. That goes here, 25r squared. Plus, so this says I take the first and the last and I multiply them together. So in other words, I take 5r and I take 4t and I multiply them together and I get 20 RT. 20 RT. So that goes here, 20 RT. Then that says maybe, so then the next one will be plus, that's a plus here, not a T, that's a plus. And then that says I take the last, which is 4T, and I multiply by itself twice. So actually say 4T times 4T, and you notice you can get 16T squared. So that's this, 16T squared. Okay, so the answer is, well, for this, so I factor this, so this right here was the difference of 2 cubes. So I get this binomial times this trinomial. So 5r minus 4t times, remember all the work here, notice the work, 25r squared plus 20rt plus 16t squared. Okay, and that parentheses should be on the outside. So now that goes here. So don't forget the GCF was 2, so that has to be part of the answer. So I'm going to get 2 times the binomial, 5r minus 4t, times the trinomial, 25r squared plus 20rt plus 16t squared. All right, so there's your answer. All right, so that should be enough problems for you in terms of the difference of 2 cubes.